In this video, I'm going to be talking about the central nervous system. That is what CNS stands for, central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, all of the neurons in the brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord being a bunch of neurons. For the brain, there are three main sections we are going to discuss. We're going to talk about the brainstem, the limbic system, and the cortex. Before we do that, just a hint on something with the spinal cord, which is reflexes. Reflexes are simple automatic responses to stimuli. These involve that spinal cord. They don't really get to the brain. You are not conscious. This is not a thought about process. It is automatic, simple. For example, if you are at the doctor and she hits your knee with a mallet and your knee swings up, you don't have to ponder what to do. Your body just automatically responds. Those are going to be reflexes. And if you remember from the video on the peripheral nervous system, it is that link between the sensory pathway to the spinal cord to the motor pathway that causes those reflexes to occur. Neural networks are also something to talk about before we divide up the brain into the specific components. Neural networks are clusters of the brain's neurons working in groups. If a bunch of neurons are doing the exact same thing at the same time, why not hook each other up and help each other out? Those are what neural networks are going to be. So a lot of these parts of the brain, you could think of them as neural networks. We're going to talk about the brainstem first, then the limbic system, and then the cortex. So first, brainstem. There are several parts that you should know. One is the medulla. The medulla is what is in charge of the heartbeat and breathing. Remember, the brainstem, it's the oldest part. It is the automatic survival stuff. You cannot survive without your brainstem. So the medulla, heartbeat and breathing, can't really survive if you're not doing that. You also have the pons. The pons helps coordinate movements. It also is connected with sleep. You have the thalamus. This directs sensory messages to the cortex and sends replies to the cerebellum and medulla. So this is the relay station between your brainstem and the higher levels of your brain. Metaphorically higher, the more complex parts, the cortex, but also technically higher. The brainstem is at the base of your head. Your cortex is going to be higher up. So this is the relay center that sends sensory information that needs to be analyzed by the more complex parts and then sends a response back. And you have the reticular formation. It plays a role in arousal. If you have ADHD, your reticular formation is smaller than normal. It is difficult for you to pay attention to have adequate arousal because of your ADHD. And the cerebellum. This processes sensory input and coordinates movement, output, and balance. If your cerebellum is off, you are not going to be a good basketball player because you won't be able to look at the hoop and shoot the ball accurately to get it into the net. Your cerebellum does balance, reticular formation's arousal, thalamus is relay station, pons is movement and sleep, and medulla is heartbeat and breathing. For the limbic system, the first thing you should know about is the amygdala. Now, overall, the limbic system is in charge of emotions and drives. These tend to go together because oftentimes what drives you to act are your emotions. The amygdala we will talk about many times this semester. It is particularly linked with fear. When you have a fear response, your amygdala is going to be lit up. If you are remembering something that used to scare you or a scary memory, your amygdala is active. For women, after they give birth, their amygdala is also more active. It is that I've got to protect my baby thing. But this can also lead to obsessive compulsive thoughts and behaviors connected to fear of something happening to the baby. Amygdala, fear. The hypothalamus. This is linked to the reward center. This helps to get you to eat, to drink, regulate your temperature. It is the actions you are driven to do. If you are hungry, it is your hypothalamus that is active. If your hypothalamus is screwed up, potentially you are going to be hungry all the time, or you absolutely lose your appetite. You're never hungry. Hypothalamus what you are driven to do. Again, because drives and emotions are linked, that is why the hypothalamus falls into the limbic system. And the hippocampus. Hippocampus is connected to long-term memories. Oftentimes, the memories we have in long-term storage are emotionally connected somehow. There's some sort of emotional significance, and thus it's going to be stored long-term, which is why the hippocampus falls into this limbic system. For the cortex, this is what makes you special. This is what makes us different than other animals. This is the control center. One of the biggies, the fairly important part of the cortex, is your frontal cortex. The frontal lobe is in charge of speaking, muscle movements, planning, and judgment. If you have damage to your frontal cortex, it can affect your ability to read. It can affect your ability to speak. It can affect your ability to make good judgments. It affects your ability to plan well. This part of the brain is not fully developed until the early 20s, which is why young people can sometimes do really stupid things because they literally cannot think through the consequences of their behavior the same way an adult can, because this is the part of your brain that helps you think through consequences. Phineas Gage is a great case study for someone with frontal lobe damage. After his frontal lobe was damaged by a railroad spike going through it, it totally changed his personality, and he was not able to be as functional of an adult, to keep down a job the same way, to stay out of jail the same way, because his ability to plan and to think through consequences were not as good. The parietal lobe is in charge of body position and sensory input. If your hand is behind your back and you're not looking at it, you can still feel it's behind your back. Your parietal lobe is what is getting the signals from those joints in your hand telling you where it is. So movement is with parietal lobe, body position, touch. The occipital lobe is vision. So this gets the sensory input from your optic nerves, from your eyes. If that is damaged, it will affect your ability to see. And finally, the temporal lobe is the fourth lobe in the cortex. This has to do with hearing. So the temporal lobe is getting information from your ears. You also have what's called the motor cortex. This is not a specific lobe, but this is part of the cortex, and it controls voluntary movements. This is going to be connected to that somatic peripheral nervous system. This is what you choose to do. This is not going to be involuntary. Those involuntary, more reflex type movements don't even need to go to the brain. They're just stopping at the spinal cord. If it goes all the way to the brain, it is going via the thalamus to this motor cortex. The somatosensory part of the cortex has to do with touch and body position. So more than just voluntary movements, this is your sensations of moving. And you have association areas. Multiple parts of your brain can be involved in one action, one mental function, like learning, remembering, thinking, speaking. And so these association areas are these combined areas that are in charge of these. You do not need to break this down any more than knowing association areas means when higher mental functions occur in multiple areas. So you have somatosensory, body, touch, movement, sensations, voluntary movements, motor. The other thing connected a similar fashion is the parietal lobe, which is sensory input for body position and touch. You will not need to distinguish between these really in depth, since in general psychology these are connected. We're not getting that nitpicky. Frontal lobe, speaking and judgment. Occipital lobe, vision. Temporal lobe, hearing. These are all the parts of the brain that are fair game that you should know.